Chapter 10 of Tractate Shabbos begins with a Mishnah discussing some exceptions to when you're liable for carrying certain items, even though it's less than the defined minimums. Seeds, which are stored for planting, a substance to use as a sample for customers, or as a medicine, and you carry with those things, you're liable for carrying any amount. Other people are liable for the defined amount earlier. If this person carries these items back in and no longer has the above specific intents, then they're no longer liable for any amount, and he's liable for the earlier defined amount instead. The Gemara explains that these exceptions apply even if you forgot why you stored them and you're just carrying them around. You're presumed to be carrying them based on your original intent. We teach that these laws of any amount even apply to something as tiny as a kernel of wheat. We also ask if it goes according to what you intend as you go out. Does that mean you could intend to take everything in your house out and then take out a few objects and that means you'd be exempt because that wasn't the full extent of your original intention? Well, no, as your intent is negated by the consensus of everybody, which is that the smaller amount you're carrying is still a significant amount even though it's not everything in your house. There is further discussion and argument on these concepts. There's also a point on throwing seeds into storehouses, which is presumed to have nullified your intent if you do that. New Mishnah, if you take some food and put it on the threshold of your house between the private and public domain, and then you or somebody else picks it up from there and takes it into the public domain, everybody's exempt because you didn't do all the actions at once. Similarly, if you have a basket of food and place it in the public domain, with part of it still being in the private domain, you're fine unless it's all the way in the public domain. The Gemara has an option that the threshold in question must be a carmelis, a neutral area, as mainly discussed in Chapter 1 of Tractate Shabbos, for this case to work, but others disagree. The case of the basket of produce, partially between domains, must be with larger produce, because if it's something small, like mustard seeds, there's definitely going to be some seeds that are fully in the public domain, according to the opinion that the produce don't go according to the basket overall. Others disagree and say they do. This would cause some issues with the actual case, but they're resolved. It also explains their opinions with other cases, like spice peddlers' baskets. We try to bring proofs either way for each opinion. New Mishnah. You're not allowed to carry items on Shabbos in your right or left hand, on your chest, or on your shoulders, as that's how the implements were carried by the tabernacle. You're exempt, however, if you carry it in a different manner, such as with your foot, in your mouth, in your underarm, in your ear, in your hair, in your money belt with the opening hanging downward, between your money belt and your shirt, in the hem of your cloak, or in your shoe or sandal. The Gemara says that carrying an item between domains above 10 handbreadths in the ear is not allowed, as that's how some things were carried by the tabernacle. And within our calculations, it said that the Levium, the Levites, were 10 ames tall, which is very tall, and they were carrying implements on poles above their shoulders, so the math makes it above 10 handbreadths. We have to learn that the Levium were that tall, and not just Moshe, which we know was 10 ames tall based on an earlier source, because you might have thought that Moshe was an exceptionally tall person, as it said that the divine presence only rests on a person who is wise, strong, wealthy, and tall. There's discussion about carrying something on your head, which a small minority country did, so we say anybody, even people from that country, are exempt if they do that, as most people don't do such a thing. New Mishnah, if you're carrying an item and it shifts, so now it's behind you, you're exempt. If you're carrying it behind you and it shifts in front of you, you're liable. By a woman carrying something by her underskirt or a letter carrier, they're liable if it shifts either way. The Gemara argues about the first case. Some say the first and second statement about it shifting behind or in front of you are actually discussing the same point in regards to it shifting, and it's actually two arguing opinions saying you're either liable or exempt. Some say that no, there is a difference, as if you're carrying it in front of you, you want it to be guarded, so if it shifts behind you, it's now in a poorly guarded manner, so that's not what you intended, so you'd be exempt. On the other hand, if it was behind you, you didn't care what it was doing, so you're still liable if it shifts in front of you. There are further qualifications brought. There is further discussion. It's brought that if you tie it behind you and it stays behind you, you're still liable, and if it's on the back of your hand or foot, you're exempt. There is argument which of these two the case of a money belt with a downward opening is compared to, and it clarifies the remaining cases of the Mishnah. New Mishnah. Obviously, if you carry a loaf of bread from a private domain to a public domain, you're liable. However, if two people take it out, they're both exempt. If the item required two people to take it out, some say they're both liable, others say they're both exempt. The Gemara elaborates their opinions and explains their logic. There's a bit more stated on that topic. It also says that if a person was able to carry an item himself and somebody helps him, the person who could carry it himself is liable, as the other guy was only aiding him, which is not considered to be significant. This about being aided gets into a point about bugs and the laws of impurity in regards to its legs aiding it. We say that this opinion is correct, that in those regards that the legs are considered aids to the animal, and that has ramifications by the laws of impurity. There is another proof brought from points on a Kohen standing while performing his service that both his legs need to be on the floor of the temple, not one of them on a vessel or something. Another point is brought that it's permissible for a Kohen to do his service with his right hand while aided with his left hand, a left hand not normally being allowed, as an aiding hand is considered insignificant. There's further argument and proofs on this topic. New Mishnah. If you carry food, but less than the above listed amounts, but it's in a container, you're exempt, as the container is considered secondary to the food. Similarly, you're exempt for carrying a bed with a person on it, as the bed is considered secondary to the person. You're liable for carrying a corpse on a bed, though. Carrying a corpse part, or part of an animal carcass the size of an olive, or part of a dead sherrit, an insect or similar, the size of a lentil, some say you're liable, some say you're exempt. The Gemara expands on these cases a bit. It discusses certain types of animals on this topic, and it discusses if you're allowed to carry a bound creature. These topics are, of course, discussed a bit further. New Mishnah, we're going to discuss some of the toldais, the subcategories of some of the forms of work listed earlier. Removing your fingernails with other fingernails or your teeth, or removing hair or facial hair with your hands, or a woman who braids her hair, paints her eyes, or fixes her hair. Some say you're liable, some say these are only rabbinic enactments. The Gemara says that obviously removing your nails with a tool on Shabbos makes you liable. There's some discussion that you're exempt for removing the fingernails of somebody else. The amount of hair that's problematic, according to source, is 2 minimum. There's further discussion on cutting nails, including the discussion on exceptions if they're in a uniquely painful manner. There's argument as to what exactly the issue of braiding, painting, and adjusting your hair is. Some say the works of weaving, writing, and spinning. Others say the last two are actually dyeing and building, which is a term used for hair braiding in some places back then. Some other things you can't do on Shabbos: coagulating milk, making cheese, sweeping, sprinkling water to prevent dust, removing honeycombs from a hive, all are problematic. Some say only of rabbinic enactments. Some say the issue of milking is extracting, coagulating milk is selecting, and making cheese is an issue of building. It says the sources and discusses the other ones we said. New Mishnah, removing a plant from a perforated flower pot makes you liable. From an unperforated flower pot, you're exempt. Rabbi Shimon says you're exempt by both. Rabbi Shimon has an exception by laws of purity by a perforated flower pot. There's discussion if there's a hole right beneath the flower, if there's a small gap, then the roots are considered attached to the ground and it may not be pulled out. There's some qualifications with an earthenware pot in regards to impurity. If there's a hole large enough to let out liquid, it's impure as a shard. It could be used to mix the purification waters of the paraduma. If it gets a hole big enough for liquids to come in, it can't be used for purification liquid, but it's considered detached from the ground in regards to plants growing inside and the laws of impurity. If the hole was the size of a small root, it is unfit to render seeds growing inside susceptible to impurity, but it is a valid utensil with regard to holding olives and impurity. If the hole is large enough that olives can fall through, it is pure with regards to being able to contain olives, but it is a utensil with regard to containing pomegranates. If the hole is big enough that pomegranates can fall through, it's no longer subject to the laws of impurity, but if it has a sealed cover, it has the status until majority of the utensil has broken off. Some hold that this point about the sealed cover blocking impurity unless majority is broken applies to a large earthenware utensil, and that about a pomegranate-sized hole only applies to a small utensil. This is discussed a bit further. One opinion says that if the hole is big enough to let olives through, then it's considered pure with these laws, and others say that such vessels are similar to dung, stone, or clay utensils, that they are totally non-susceptible to impurity, biblical or rabbinic, and the same point about the sealed cover majority breaking applies here too. And that's the end of chapter 10.